Thanks, Dwayne. We are starting at 10:04. Okay, we try.
I'm about to go live.
Good morning. Welcome to the Preschool to Prison Pipeline, production of the Social Justice Ministry of the Alfred Street Baptist Church, the Education and Reform Pillar. My name is Camille Burden. I am one of the co-leads for the Education Pillar Subcommittee of the Social Justice Ministry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen. I am also one of the co-leads for the Social Justice Ministry Education Reform Pillar. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today, we hope to provide you not only with a general overview of the preschool to prison pipeline that impacts our nation's most vulnerable young people, but also insight into its causes and the approaches that schools are using to combat this problem and keep children in school and learning every day. Now we have some remarks from our senior pastor.
Beloved, grace and peace be unto you from God who loves us as a father and a mother, and Jesus Christ who alone is our resurrected, our risen, our reigning, and our returning Redeemer. I'm Pastor Howard John Wesley on behalf of the entire family of faith of the Alfred Street Baptist Church here in Alexandria, Virginia, and even more from our social justice ministry. I want to welcome you to what I believe is one of the most critical forum, panel, and discussions we can have in this day in which we live, the preschool to prison pipeline. At Alfred Street, we believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ and social justice go hand in hand. As a matter of fact, in the Bible, the term righteousness is the same word for justice, because in God's eyes, you cannot be righteous and not also advocate for justice. And today we gather to discuss how we advocate for justice for our children in creating a healthy, a safe, and a just learning environment. To me, one of the greatest heroes of the Bible are these Hebrew midwives that we read about in the book of Exodus. There are some heroes and sheroes because they realize that there's a threat against the children, and they advocate and intervene and intercede to protect them from the death and the destruction that Pharaoh seeks over their lives. In our world today, we need men and women who do the exact same thing. Adults who intercede for proper disciplinary and unbiased ways of disciplining our children in their school environments. That's what we're here to talk about today. The call of God on our lives to protect our children, to be certain that even at the youngest age, they are not pointed towards the prison pipeline, but pointed towards their possibility and potential. To be those who advocate and intercede with administrators and teachers for fair and unbiased and just processes for all of our children. So I welcome you. And my prayer is that when this day is done, you will not only be more informed, but more empowered to use your voice. I want to send a very special welcome to all of our guests from the school systems of Alexandria and Fairfax and the NAACP. I believe God has got the right people in the right place to say the right thing. So let's get into it as we learn to protect our children in their preschool years from the prison pipeline.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Deacon Carol Hebron. As we begin this session, the preschool to prison pipeline, I want to start off with a couple of scripture verses from one of the wisdom books of the Bible, the book of Proverbs. Chapter 4, verse number 13 tells us, "Take firm hold of instruction. Do not let go. Keep her, for she is your life." And again, referring to the book of Proverbs, chapter 22, verse number 6 reads, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." This speaks to us as parents, as leaders and influencers in children's lives. We have a specific role and a task to train the children in the way that they should go. And part of that training enables them to be in school. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father God, this morning, before we ask for anything, we want to thank you for everything. Lord, thank you for waking us up today. Lord, thank you for the shelter that we have around us and over us. Lord, thank you that none of us are waking up hungry this morning. Lord, thank you for the air in our lungs, the blood in our veins. Lord, we pray today that you allow your spirit to have her way in this event, that she may permeate all through us, through our minds, our hearts, and let her take over our tongues, that we may speak a word of wisdom as it comes from you, and enable us to continue to walk on your path that you light for us and do your will. And Father God, we just ask finally that you let your justice become reality right here, right now. And for those of us that have the opportunity to correct wrongs and apply justice where injustice prevails. Lord, we ask all of this in the magnificent, marvelous, and majestic name of your Son, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Ebony Coleman, lay member of the Alfred Street Social Justice Ministry, and I'd like to introduce you to the education reform pillar of the ministry. The Alfred Street Baptist Church Social Justice Ministry is the vision fulfilled of our pastor, Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, who spearheaded the ministry during the wake of the Trayvon Martin killing. Alfred Street Social Justice Ministry is dedicated to tackling the root causes of modern day injustices. The ministry is grounded in 5 pillars: economic justice, voter education and empowerment, criminal justice reform, racial healing and reconciliation, and education reform. Guided by the scripture Hosea 4:6, which states, "My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge." The work of the education reform pillar seeks to show love for the youth and act as a community of guardians for youth and locally and nationally by focusing on how education-based systems and policies contribute to social inequities and what we can do as individuals and communities to address them. So before we start the panelist presentations, I'd like to highlight that the open question and answer portion is your opportunity to receive answers to your burning questions. So we encourage you to write in the questions box. The question and answer box is in Zoom. You should find it at the bottom right corner of your screen. And we will cover as many questions as possible, time permitting. Thank you.
My name is Gail Templeton. I'm the president of the Alfred Street Baptist Church Social Justice Ministry. I am so pleased to provide an introduction to today's panelists. Attorney Valerie Slater is an attorney activist who leads the Rise for Youth Coalition and advocates for the rights of youth, their families, and their communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Previously, Attorney Valerie worked as a juvenile justice attorney with Legal Aid Justice Center and protected the rights of children with disabilities in community, residential, and juvenile justice facilities throughout the state at the Disability Law Center of Virginia. Attorney Valerie brings to her work an unwavering commitment to strengthening youth and communities to lead efforts and realize their visions for change. Attorney Sean Perryman. Attorney Sean is an activist and the president of the Fairfax County NAACP. He is the youngest president in the branch's 102-year-old history. In this organization, he has been a leader on addressing the school-to-prison pipeline, affordable housing, and worker protections during the coronavirus pandemic. A frequent speaker and author on race, equity, and police and criminal justice reform. Sean is also an acknowledged leader and speaker for equity in technology and artificial intelligence policy. He is currently exploring a run for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. Dr. Scott Brabrand. He began his career in Fairfax County Public Schools as a social studies teacher in 1994 before progressing to assistant principal at Herndon High and associate principal at Lake Braddock Secondary School. Next up, principal at Fairfax High School, cluster assistant superintendent, and since 2017, the superintendent of schools for Fairfax County. In this role, he is responsible for the 10th largest school district in the nation. In addition to his day job, Dr. Brabrand frequently collaborates with superintendents and chancellors across the nation and has also taught courses on public school law and instructional issues in K-12 education. Dr. Bryn Elliott is the Chief School Improvement and Supports for the DC Public Schools. She is a systems thinker and innovator with more than 23 years of experience as a public educator in the Mid-Atlantic region. Dr. Elliott is committed to building and leading equity and socio-emotional learning initiatives and works regularly with school-based staff to eliminate the predictability of student outcomes by race, ability, and socioeconomics. Dr. Elliott strongly believes that students can and want to succeed and work strategically to build a team of educators, students, parents, and community members who believe the same. Mr. Gregory Baldwin is the school climate and culture specialist for Alexandria City Public Schools in Alexandria, Virginia. He has been an educator for nearly 30 years, and in his current role, he serves as the district-wide coordinator for restorative practices, a social science that studies how to improve and repair relationships between people and communities. He has also served as the chairman of the Alexandria City Community Criminal Justice Board for several years and collaborates with local law enforcement, court services, and other city agencies to develop a program that will use restorative practices as an early diversion option for juvenile offenders in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. He is a graduate of T.C. Williams High School in the city of Alexandria. Without further ado, let's hear from our first panelist, attorney activist Valerie Slater.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this needful conversation and to present along with these other distinguished panelists. Again, my name is Valerie Slater, Executive Director of RISE for Youth. RISE stands for Reinvest in Supportive Environments, because we believe that prison is no place for children, and we work with families, with communities, with young folks to ensure that they are able to realize their dreams. And I'm going to be talking about what exactly is the school to prison pipeline? What is this preschool to prison pipeline? And we'll begin with the facts. Next slide. So, the definition, the school to prison pipeline, it's discipline policies and procedures that push youth into justice system involvement for behaviors that should be handled at the school level. And it's also the excessive use of disciplinary practices that ultimately increase the likelihood of children being pushed out of school. And once they're out of school, that of course increases the likelihood that they'll either drop out or that they will be involved with the justice system. Just one out-of-school suspension significantly increases the likelihood that a child will be involved with the justice system. That's just one. So that means that we must be doing everything that we can to keep children in school. Next slide. So the Office of Civil Rights, when we look at their data, unfortunately, it's really out of date, but when we look at the 2015, 16, and 17 school years, we're able to see where SROs are in Virginia. And for me, it's really alarming that even in elementary school, we have begun to introduce SROs. So by 2017, 34% of elementary schools in Virginia had SROs. Now that we have them in middle school and in high school, you know, upwards of 80%. I mean, we're heading towards policing children at a greater rate than we are at providing them opportunities for other resources like counselors, mental health providers, and all of those other resources that would be much more effective at ensuring that a learning environment is a safe place for children and one that they can access apart from all of the other stressors that they may be experiencing in their lives. Next slide. So when we want to look at how we best support children and how we in Virginia, how we define supporting children, we should follow the money, right? When we look at the funds that are being expended on SROs, that number is going up significantly, while when we look at support staff in school and how we are funding that, those dollars are going down significantly. We, right now in Virginia, the standards of quality, they have not been fully funded for so many years. And when we were in 2017, when we looked at the need to cut funding, And we never fully funded the standards of quality, yet we continue to increase the amount of money that is going into SROs. Now, just in September 10th, the COPS, it is a federal agency for ensuring that schools are safe places. They have granted upwards of $50 million for school safety, but it's for officers. Now, that's very, very troubling when we consider police were entered into school because we wanted to ensure that schools were safe. We wanted to ensure that school shootings weren't happening. But since police have been introduced, that is not at all what police officers have been doing. They have been intervening in situations that they should not have been intervening in. And in situations where school discipline should be handled by school staff, that is where we are finding more and more frequently SROs are intervening. And when the Office of School Violence Prevention Programs, when they have awarded this money that they have announced, they've awarded $500,000 to Alexandria Public Schools, $500,000 to Chesterfield County Public Schools, and $354,000 to Bedford County Public Schools. Now, I find it incredibly troubling that we are still funding SRO programs, but we are not providing more funding for mental health counselors, more funding for even school nurses. It's unfortunate that so many more students are in school with SROs than they are with an appropriate number of school counselors, with an appropriate number of school nurses, with an appropriate number of mental health counselors, and any other resource and support that would provide a learning environment that is healthy for children versus officers that are there to police children. Next slide. So, I've covered quite a bit of this, but ultimately what we need to understand is we cannot continue to fund police in school when we are wanting a return on our investment that is children who are better prepared to interact in society and to be contributing members, students who are ready to enter into higher education or into skilled labor trainings. If we are wanting to provide children with what is necessary to propel them towards success, then we need to stop policing them and create opportunities for them. Next slide. Next slide. So when we look at why young folks are being suspended and expelled from school, unfortunately, it's an outrageous thing that we are even suspending children for attendance. If kids aren't coming to school, the very last thing we need to do is to suspend them. School shouldn't be the place where when you aren't showing up, the response is to not allow you to attend. Students shouldn't be suspended for having a cell phone out, or even if a child is misbehaving and talking back, sending them home is not going to instruct that child on better ways to interact and to engage. I'm not going to read down the list, next slide, but it is really important for us to understand that we cannot continue to push children out of school in order to teach them how to behave in school. School is supposed to be the place where children come to gain a better learning and understanding of how to engage with their peers, how to engage with adults and with others, and yet we are pushing them out instead. And we need to also look at the disparities in who's being pushed out and who's being pushed into engagement with law enforcement. You know, when we look at these numbers, again, when we're talking about OCR data, it is always unfortunately behind the times. But when you look at the orange graph line, that is the percentage of a student population versus the green line, which is telling us how often that child is being referred to law enforcement. And you can see that for Black students, the disproportionality is significant, right? While they are referred to law enforcement less than their white counterparts, when we look at their representation in the population, it is double what their representation is, and that's a problem. We should not be referring students to law enforcement, but based on their race. Next slide. Next slide. So when we look at some of the offenses that children have been referred to law enforcement for, it's really, really troubling, because when we look at what we're calling a disruption of school, we're talking about a student who has perhaps sprayed perfume or such minor things, and disorderly conduct, kicking a trash can, and assault, throwing a carrot, a weapon, a butter knife, or a child's plastic knife. We have got to do better. When it comes to ensuring that a learning environment is safe, that's one thing. But disciplining children because instructors are perhaps frustrated, or because other resources are not available in a schoolroom, we cannot allow for such minor offenses as those listed here to be considered reasons for children to then become involved with law enforcement. Next slide. So when we are talking about who is providing supports to our children in school, we believe that parents and community members have got to be central to that conversation. School divisions, we recognize that you are tasked with providing an education to all of our students, but at the same time, it has got to be a collaborative effort. It's got to be school divisions and parents and other community members all working together to create the learning environment that is most safe. And if we are not having input from the community, if the community is not having even oversight over the way things are happening within school divisions, then we end up with less trust, less buy-in, and less understanding. And especially in communities of color, where children, unfortunately, there is such a disproportionate number of children of color who are pushed out of school and then also referred to law enforcement. Next slide. So we understand that if we indeed are pushing children out of school, and if they are indeed having engagement with law enforcement, we have got to understand what that is doing to our children. It is having a psychological effect on them, right? We're telling children that childlike behavior can be criminalized. You're a criminal because you talked back. You're a criminal because your pants were sagging. You're a criminal because you moved your body in a certain way and it perhaps hit the law enforcement officer, and now you potentially are facing felony charges. We have got to do better at ensuring that children have access to learning and not access to police officers. Next slide. So when we push children out of school, we recognize that they're not only falling behind in their classes, but it begins to help them, it causes them to feel alienated, to feel as if they don't have a place in the learning environment, and it could lead to children dropping out of school. So ultimately, what I would like to leave with you all, next slide, what I would like to leave with you is that if we are indeed looking for the best way to support children, that is never going to be by infusing law enforcement into the school environment. It's going to be by providing loving and caring environments where children, even those children that are having the greatest struggles, whether those struggles are happening in home, whether they are happening in the community, whether they're happening on the school bus or at the bus stop, or whether it's happening on the walk to school, or whether it's happening in school, that we are wrapping around them with love and support rather than with police and with handcuffs and with a justice system that is ready to just take away their future. That's what I would like to leave with you all. I have other resources that I would like to make available to everyone, but as just a closing thought, when we think of the children who are ages 15 to 17, those are the children who are most likely to end up in prison in Virginia, in custody in Virginia. 21% of youth ages 15 to 17 are Black, but they make up 57% of young people who are suspended from school. They make up 49% of young people who are reported to the juvenile justice system or to juvenile courts by school authorities. There are 42% of young people reported to juvenile intake officers or the court services unit. There are 54% of young people detained in local jails, youth jails, but they are 72% of the students who are in the custody of the Department of Juvenile Justice. We have gone from 21% all the way to 72%. We have got to do better by children of color. We have got to do better by all children. Let's stop policing them and start providing opportunities for them to succeed. Thank you all so very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the folks at Alfred Street for inviting me. My name is Sean Perryman. I'm the president of the Fairfax County NAACP. Really excited to be here with you. I have to start by saying I agree with virtually everything Valerie said, and I'll follow up on that and try to tell you how we have dealt with some of those issues here in Fairfax County. So I'll start with my slides. Really quickly, these are the education priorities for the Fairfax County NAACP. Obviously, with COVID, we're thinking about the most vulnerable students. Not everyone is going to be able to learn virtually. So we need to think about creating detailed online learning plans to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. I know we're talking about the preschool to prison pipeline, but often when kids are not feeling like they're getting the education that they need, this is when we see issues arise. But I want to talk about some of the things that Valerie touched on and some of our agenda. If you look at number 3, we want the school board to take a vote on removing school resource officers from schools. Oftentimes, this is one of the more controversial issues that we bring up. But I always argue that the SROs have not been shown to prevent school shootings. The data has not shown that. If you look at a 2018 study from the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office, what for Valerie's data that supports this as well, is that you see an increase in arrests for Black, Latinx, and disabled students. Almost those are the 3 populations that we see the most impact to when we have the introduction of SROs into schools. And to Valerie's point, and I saw one of the questions in the chat, they said, what does school safety look like without SROs? Well, first of all, we have to dismiss that sort of myth that SROs are only dealing with school safety issues. As Valerie mentioned, a lot of times what we're seeing is disciplinary actions, even criminal actions for misbehavior. So one of the things that we saw that alerted us to an issue with SROs a few years back was a number of arrests that were disproportionate to Black and Latinx students in Herndon Middle School. When we dug into that data, almost all those middle schoolers were being charged with disorderly conduct, which is subjective criteria and essentially could be anything. It could be throwing the baby carrot, as we saw, or it could be simply talking back. And this became an issue for which they were arrested for. When we started to dig into that issue and work with the schools and work with the police to change the memorandum of understanding, which is what controls how the SROs operate in the schools, when we changed that memorandum of understanding, in the first year, we saw a 60% drop in arrests countywide. In the second year, we saw a 45% drop in arrests. So a lot of these arrests were not for safety issues. These were simply kids misbehaving. And this is what I tried to stress to everyone. Earlier this year, myself and Delegate Kay Corey wrote a letter to the governor asking him to take away the money from the SRO programs and put those towards counselors. Because right now, as many of you maybe parents are experiencing, we are learning virtually, but we are still paying for the SRO officers to guard empty schools. So that money is better spent on counselors, especially in this learning environment where kids are in need of extra assistance and maybe going through the stress of both the pandemic. Their parents may be uncertain in their working environment. We need to make sure we're actually providing the support system that children need. So this is one of the things that we have been championing. Just really quickly going through some of our other issues that we've been speaking about. We are also asking for the review of the AAP program and how that process goes. We're also talking about the role of teachers, and I'll get into that and how there is an interplay between the number of teachers of color we have in the Fairfax system and the number of arrests. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm showing this right here. This is and many of you may not be able to see the slides, but I will read this to you. This is a chart that we got from FCPS that talks about disruptive behavior. The first column is 2016 to 2017. The second one is 2017 through 2018. And the third is 2018 through 2019. The pink bar that's far above everyone else and the orange bar that's far above everyone else is Black students is the orange bar, and the pink bar is students with disabilities. This is who are deemed as disruptive in Fairfax County, the pink and orange. And that goes to what we said, that largely when we see these problems, these are these students who they're seen as disruptive are Black, Latino, or disabled in some way. Can we go to the next slide? This is from Herndon Middle School, which is a school that, again, I stress we've received the most issues with the SRO officers, with seeing the issue of disorderly conduct being an arresting charge there. And this is why, by the way, the Fairfax County NAACP also a few years back fought tooth and nail and were successful in keeping the SROs out of elementary school. Because again, while most parents would assume that SROs give some feeling of safety, when we look at the data, what we see is an increase in disciplinary actions and arrest actions. And in fact, if you looking at other places around the country, this remains true. Waco County, Texas, got rid of their SRO program and removed it or reduced it significantly in schools. And they saw a 77% decrease in disciplinary actions as well as arrests. So we can keep our schools safe without having officers roaming the halls and interacting with students on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that the Fairfax NAACP firmly believes and talks about. But when I talk about the disruptive behavior here, usually this is the start when we talk about the preschool to prison pipeline. It is a teacher deeming a kid as a bad apple, deeming them as disruptive in some way. And that may be because they cannot relate to those students. Can we go to the next slide? But I wanted to point out the incident of Langley High School. Now, in Langley High School, the disruptive learners here are seen as largely the English learners. So we see the first one, the green bar is people who are learning English. The orange bar is the Black students. And this is particularly interesting because if you're looking at the 2016 and 2017, you see the orange bar just trails behind the green. Same thing, 2017 and 18, orange bar trails behind the green. And then in 2018 to 2019, there is no Black student disruption there. Now, we don't know what the cause of this was. The only difference that we saw in Langley in 2018, the 2018 to 2019 school year, was they hired a Black principal. Now, we can't prove that that's the cause of why we don't see Black students here, but what we know is in Fairfax County, we do have an issue of teacher hiring in our schools. There are over 25 schools in Fairfax County that have no teachers of color. This is a huge issue, and it plays into the preschool to prison pipeline because when you don't have these black principals, you don't have Black teachers, our students, our kids are more likely to be seen as disruptive, seen as a problem. And again, I cannot prove the causation of what happened at Langley, but surely there seems to be some sort of correlation of hiring this black principal, and then Langley, which does not have a huge Black population, has about 22 Black kids. They don't appear on this chart anymore. But still, there is concerning data here, obviously, when you see English learners is one of the higher problems in Langley. That strikes me and would raise my antenna that this is not necessarily an issue of safety or actual disruption, but maybe the teacher's not able to relate to those students. So next slide, please. Oh, and this is more of the same, the students with disabilities, Black kids. I wanted to reemphasize that this is what we see countywide as far as disruptive behavior year after year. We see Black students, disabled students, Latino students as being selected as the disruptive problem in the school system. And this, again, contributes to the preschool to prison pipeline. So I know many of you, our parents, are interested in how do we advocate for our children? How do we keep our children safe? And I think what's right for it is looking at what is the memorandum of understanding between your school system and the police. How are they able to police in schools? What are they able to arrest for? One of the things that we had seen in our memorandum of understanding was that police could police for things such as cultural tendencies and sort of buzzwords like that raised alarm bells. You want to make sure that the police are limited in what they can do in your schools. And again, we argue that they should not be in the school building. Now, the NAACP, Fairfax NAACP chapter, we would not care if the police were outside the schools across the street. It's when they are serving as a role of both, teacher, counselor, mentor, the police aren't trained for that. And with children who they cannot relate to, we see what that leads to. You see at everyday disciplinary disruption issues become criminal issues. And so we want to avoid that here, both in Fairfax County and Virginia at large. Next slide. And then finally, this is the number of teachers here in the county broken down by demographics. And you can see year over year that there's a huge issue with teacher hiring, again, over 25 schools without teachers of color. GMU did a study and found that Fairfax County had a very rich applicant pool that was diverse. Credit to Dr. Brabrand for finally putting in a hiring system, because up to 2 years ago, or before Dr. Brabrand came, there was no hiring system in the 10th largest school district in the country, which is a huge issue. But when we see that we are not getting teachers of color, and again, when we were hiring teachers of color, we were putting them in the same schools. So that is another issue. It's not just hiring them, it's making sure that all students see a teacher of color, see them. And then the teachers, this not only relates to disciplinary issues, but it also relates to the AP program, because your teacher is often the one who identifies you as gifted or talented. This summer, Dr. Brabrand and the school system hired over 1,000 teachers. We are still waiting for the data on what the breakdown is demographically of those teachers, because we not only want to see teachers of color, we want to see them in the core curriculum. We don't want them to just be coaches. We want them to be teaching math and science and everything else. So this is something that where parents can weigh in. Does my school have teachers of color? What does the demographics look like? And let your principal, let your superintendent know that this is important to you, because this will have impacts on not only AP program, on the curriculum, but also on disciplinary actions. And thank you for the time.
Thank you. I'm Scott Brabrand, Superintendent of Fairfax County Public Schools. I want to say again, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for having Alfred Street really put this forum together. It's an honor too to follow what Valerie and Sean have said, and I will give some additional insights and perspective in my role as Division Superintendent for Fairfax County Public Schools. I'm glad we're here. We need these conversations. We have been working on this work, and we want to continue to partner with all of you on this call to move our school division in the right direction around issues of discipline, disproportionality, and equity. If we could go to some of the slides I brought, I would love to go ahead and get started. One of the things that we are doing, and I communicated at our leadership conference this year, and we've been talking about for the last few years, but we are elevating, is having equity at the center of everything that we do in Fairfax County. If we could go to the next slide. I really want to talk about what that means. That's a word that a lot of people say, but what does it mean? It's really moving from being reactive to proactive. It's about unifying our vision around equity. And it means creating student-centered experiences in the classroom, in the school, where student voice matters, where student voice is heard. We have to, in our classrooms, affirm and sustain racial, linguistic, and cultural identities. We're going to be doing a school board work session next week around our work with anti-racist and anti-bias curriculum. We're making major changes to our curriculum and materials, taking out inappropriate materials, thousands and thousands of lessons and pages, and infusing in diverse curriculum that represents all kids and all cultures. One of the things, again, about equity is not just doing it in the lesson plans and the materials, but in the classroom conversations, that student voice is elevated, and those that have not felt heard or seen or respected or felt marginalized have a role in the classroom with the teacher, have a role in the school. And we know, and we are committed to recognizing and disrupting systems that create an equitable outcomes, including discipline. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. This is about leading with courage. I appreciated the prayers at the beginning that we need to give ourselves grace, not grief. And we can work together with communities of faith like Alfred Street and do the righteous work of making our systems better for every kid. If we can go to the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit about our commitments to addressing discipline disproportionality. We engaged external consultants in a discipline study. We created a discipline equity plan, and we made massive changes to what we call SR&R, our student rights and responsibilities. We've completely changed that document. I know one of the things you saw Valerie share earlier were those number of discipline incidences. A lot of those are what we call the D codes: disrespect, defiance, disruptive demonstration. Well, we have removed those from our SR&R this year. Our SR&R is now going to be focused on the impact of behavior and what the behavior is, with a focus on intervention and restorative practices. And I'm very excited about that. We have completely revamped our approach to school discipline. The state is looking on implementing and removing those D codes next year. We're not waiting. We're doing it this year. And I'm very excited about the changes that will happen systematically as a result of that. One other note here, it's not expressly on here, but I just do want to note it, not just the SR&R. Sean made reference to it. We did work 2 or 3 years ago with the NAACP at the table, the ACLU at the table, major community groups. It was done by the communities of trust to revamp our SRO MOU. And as Sean said, we've seen dramatic reductions in the number of referrals to law enforcement in our schools. I do believe that our SROs have a valuable place in our school, but we do not want SROs engaging in school matters and creating a referral to the prison pipeline. We've done amazing work with the community and their input, revamping the SRO MOU. I partnered with the chief of police, and we've seen dramatic reductions, and we will continue to work on that as we move forward. I'd like to go to the next slide. Overall, Less than 5% of our students are being referred for even one or more discipline behavior incidences. 2% are receive an out-of-school suspension. So our numbers overall are low. However, what Sean said, I don't dispute it and I acknowledge it, is that while our numbers may be lower than many other systems, a system I was in as superintendent when I went as a new superintendent before coming back to Fairfax, saw numbers far, far higher for this, with kids being involved in discipline referrals, 10, 20 times higher, 10 times higher than these percentages. But we still do have disproportionality. However, that disproportionality is on the decline in our system. I want to show you that in just a moment. We're using a risk ratio measure. I'm very proud that we've started to put out the last 2 years as part of our equity profile data around race and ethnicity. We're not going to hide behind our challenges. We need to hit them face on. And I want you to know that we are making real progress. So if we can go to the next slide. This risk ratio is really a way of being able to determine the risk of one group compared to the risk of another group. It's the best way to really summarize the group's risk of being referred for discipline and receiving behavioral intervention referral. And we recognize that our African-American kids have received disproportionate discipline, and it is something we are committed to working on. We also see that with some of our special education kids, and we are equally committed, really, frankly, for any group where there's disproportionality, to unpack what's going on and to then develop system practices and protocols to address those. If we can go to the next slide, around risk ratio. I want you to see this for both special ed and African American, as I just mentioned. The risk ratio, go back now about 8 years. For special education, it was over 6.01. Again, a 1.0 would be proportionate discipline to the percentage of students in the school. It was at 6.01 for special ed in 2012. And for our Black students, it was at 4.27. We have made real strides, as you can see, over the last 6-7 years. And again, like Sean and Valerie said, the data lags even from the state. And we're working to get that data updated as soon as possible. We've gone from a risk ratio of over 6 8 years ago to just about 2 in the 18-19 year. I believe our latest data will also show continuing dramatic reductions, both for our special ed, and then you can see for our African American, it was over 4, a little over 4, now it's a little over 2. Again, 2 is still disproportionate for both special ed and African American students, but it is absolutely headed in the right direction, and we are committed at the school level, at the regional assistant superintendent level, and at the division level. And I've made clear our expectations to both teachers and principals that we need to eliminate discipline disproportionality. If we can go to the next slide. What our equity commitments are that we have started over 2 years ago with equity leads in every school and every department and office. These equity teams this year will be completing a self-assessment audit and using that audit to support goal setting in our school improvement plans. We've had tools that were available. This year, we are conducting an audit that is non-negotiable, and it's non-negotiable that the work of that audit, and as Sean pointed out, some schools are seeing tremendous differences and improvements. We need to go school to school, and that's how this work is going to be done, and have schools set equity goals based on those equity audits. We're also going to provide this year, and we'll be doing our Equity Action Plan work session to the school board next month in October. We're going to be providing policy and explicit guidance to schools when they encounter racist and bias incidences. This has been an issue that some schools handle it well, and I believe Sean and I don't know how much Valerie knows on our school system. Experiences that individual schools have done it very well. Some schools have struggled more. We're going to provide explicit guidance about what to do when you see or find or are referred to a bias incident in the school, or a racist incident, or inappropriate use of language, or saying the N-word. We need to give clear direction, and we will. We need to have the community voice in two-way partnerships. We're doing that. We're going to continue to do it. I'm here today. I've told our principals and regional assistant superintendents to continue to engage. And it's through dialogue and developing mutual respect and trust that we can get this done. More professional development around culturally responsive relationship building with kids and behavioral management, and more conversations around our vision for advanced academics. We are coming back with advanced academic recommendations next month with the board. I'll be talking about TJ admissions next week, and I am committed to leading with equity in those areas. Just quickly, next slide, professional learning. We're continuing to do work around professional learning. Our decision-making for discipline, just a quick nugget here. This is a set of systematic steps that administrators must do before administering discipline that really creates greater consistency instead of each school determining how they'll approach an incident, including the first question, has unconscious bias been considered? What does a review of the teacher's behavior management style reveal? Really digging in and having our school be reflective before we send kids into the discipline referral process. Next slide. I mentioned professional development. I'm going to be mindful of time. We've talked about much of the professional development that we're doing. If we can go to the next slide. I want you to know that we've developed now a systematic way of keeping records. Sean talked about our hiring that was done at individual schools that we've now centralized. We're doing the same thing with school discipline. We kept records at individual schools, and now we're keeping a systematic recording of discipline. We're piloting it at several schools this year, and it will go completely division-wide next year, which will give us more real-time data, less data lags, and more time to make adjustments at the division level to direct resources to schools that are struggling and still showing disproportionality. If we can go to the next slide. I want you to just see restorative justice is part of our approach in Fairfax. We're going to be doing more of it, and you can see the growth in just the last several years. It was a little less here in 1920 simply because of COVID hitting in March. Again, projected growth would have had us beyond the year last year. And I want to encourage all of you to encourage our families to do restorative justice. This is still something that we're trying to build with our families to say this is the right approach. Some of our families want to do it, some do not, to be honest. How we keep getting folks to understand we've got to bring restoration in our communities and schools, or we're going to have some of the things, even if they're not in school, manifest themselves in the community. Our communities need restoration, our schools need restoration, and we need justice for every child, and we need it in every school, and we're working to do that. Thank you, and it's again an honor to be here. I look forward to the discussion with the panelists. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Bryn Elliott, and I have the honor of serving as the Chief for School Improvement and Supports for DC Public Schools. And it is an honor today to talk with you about this important work and how our school district in DC is working to ensure that our young people are treated fairly and with a lens toward equity in all that we do, particularly around how we address student behavior. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation, I just want to start off by sharing with you the mission and vision statement for DC Public Schools. In DC Public Schools, as our vision, we want every child to feel loved, challenged, and prepared to positively influence society and thrive in life. And for me, this is the first school district that I have worked in that has really called out this idea of love, that young people feel loved. And we do a lot of work in our schools to ensure that we are supporting relationship building with our students so that they have a great sense of belonging in schools and know that this is a place where relationships are prioritized and valued, and their sense of safety is extremely important to us. Next slide. I also want to share with you our 6 capital commitments for the school district, and much of today's conversation will center on capital commitment number 4, which is 100% of our students feel loved, challenged, and prepared. But we know that all of the other components are important. So our work in ensuring that we not only double the percent of young people who are career and college ready, but we triple the percentage of students who are students of color that are reaching that level of proficiency, that we increase our graduation rate, and we increase our young people that are reading on grade level beginning in as early as kindergarten. So we know that all of those academic outcomes are equally important, but we know that when young people feel loved in our schools, that it creates an environment in which those academic outcomes can be reached. So just a little bit about the data in DC. DC Public Schools continues to be the fastest improving school district in the nation as measured by NAEP. We were really pleased with the scores that were published in 2019 that demonstrated incredible progress academically on this national measure. Next. But we know, next slide, please. But when we look at our data on a local performance measure, which is our PARC, we see significant disparities in the outcomes on that performance measure when we disaggregate our data by race. So while we do see growth happening, it is not happening at the rate that we need to have it happen at the district, that we close those gaps in achievement between our Black students, other students of color, and their white peers. Next. With regards to suspension, the district has had a significant down trajectory in our out-of-school suspensions over the last 6 years. And a lot of this work, honestly, started back in 2011 under President Obama's administration when he issued joint guidance from the Department of Education and the Department of Justice for school districts to shift how they think about school discipline and to be more focused on strategies and programs that really seek to be more restorative, more inclusive, age appropriate, and keep young people in schools. In 2014, there was a Dear Colleague letter that was issued by jointly by the Department of Education and Department of Justice that provided some detailed guidance for schools on how we could get to non-discriminatory discipline practices. And so you see here discipline data from DC Public Schools all the way back for 2013, 2014, and you can see the significant decreases in out-of-school suspensions that have taken place over time as those new policies and practices were put in place. So from 2013-14 to the 2018-19 school year, DC Public Schools was able to reduce its out-of-school suspensions by more than 40%, to close to 40%. But what we continue to see when we disaggregate our data, either by gender and by race, is that males of color are overrepresented in our suspension data. And so we know that there is still more work to be done. 2 years ago in July of 2017, our city council in DC passed the Student Fair Access to Schools Act that really limited what schools were able to suspend for. It was phased in over time, but this year students in grade 6, K through 6, will only be able to be suspended for incidents that are violence related. And I think that really helps us to ensure that our young people are only excluded from schools under the most serious conditions, and it pushes us as a district to implement additional restorative and instructional practices to support our young people in addressing any challenging behaviors, but keeping our young people in schools. One of the things that we have prioritized is reducing lost instructional time with regards to out-of-school suspensions. And so what you see here is data broken down by the elementary, middle, and high school level. You see the total number of days of suspension. So sometimes when we just talk about a suspension incident, you really can't see underneath that impact that it has for students. Sometimes those suspensions are up to 10 days, sometimes they're 1 day. So what does that really mean in terms for lost instructional time? So you see that in 2017-18, DC Public Schools students that were suspended, and it's about 8% of our students that received an out-of-school suspension that year. So the majority of students, about 92% of them, do not receive out-of-school suspensions or did not for the 17-18 school year. But the total number of days of instruction that was lost where young people were outside of the class that year was 21,267. And that's staggering when you think about that in terms of years. So there's 180 days of year. How many years does that represent? So we really focus on reducing that and have over the last couple of years. For the school year 18-19, we were able to what we call reclaim a little over 6,000 days of instruction because we had a less number of kids that were excluded from our classrooms due to a discipline infraction. And we are continuing to see this year's, the data from the 19-20 school year is a little wonky, obviously, because of COVID and students being out of school around mid-March, but we still saw even pre-COVID some significant reductions. But since the data was not apples to apples, I did not include it here. But this continues to be a priority. How do we keep our young people in schools? Next slide. So for DC Public Schools, the persistent opportunity gaps that I've highlighted here requires significant investment. So I want to talk with you a little bit more about the practices and policies that we put in place and how we work to ensure that we're putting our money where our mouth is. So 3 things I want to highlight here is district level strategies is number 1, we created a DC PS Way, which is a set of clear and consistent standards so that we have equity of expectations. We want every schools, regardless to where those schools are located in the city, to have high rigorous expectations for students. So the DCPS Way outline for our principals those expectations. Secondly, we align school support. So we have what's called a cluster support model. So each of our instructional superintendents, and we have 10 of them, have schools that they're responsible for, and they have a set of staff underneath them that help support them in addressing the needs of those schools. And then finally, a big focus on educator expertise. When young people are getting in trouble persistently, like we have to figure out not what is wrong with a student, but what is happening to our students. And so really helping to build our educators' capacity around the science of learning and development so they understand the connection between stress and the brain, how that impacts that ACEs and other indicators such as that. Next slide. We have an equity framework that guides a lot of our work, and I'll be able to talk a little bit maybe more about that in our Q&A, but we rolled out an equity framework, and next slide, please. And we also, as a district, defined equity. And for us, equity means create an environment that we're able to eliminate opportunity gaps, interrupt institutional bias, and remove barriers to social and academic success. And for us, particularly for students of color. So as a district, we own our responsibility to interrupt those institutional biases within our district that exists. And we do that through work with our people and work with our systems and ensuring that we have equity in our practices. For us, for this upcoming school year, we are focusing on trauma responsive practices because we know with both the pandemic and the increase in incidents of racial violence that our young people, as they come back to us, all have experienced some semblance of trauma, and we have to be prepared to support that in a very strategic way. Next. And so we have 5 trauma responsive practices that we've trained all of our school staff on in June, in early PD in June, and then in July, and in our pre-service, and they're listed here. But just, quickly ensuring that we focused on building relational trust, using positive and affirming language, providing space for students to practice emotional regulation when they're not doing a good job of managing their emotions. We don't want that to lead to escalation and out of school suspension. We want it to be our staff to have skills that they're able to de-escalate and support young people in addressing those emotional challenges. So here's just a list finally of the current strategies that we have in place. We monitor our student behavior. We disaggregate that by race, and we dig down to the root causes. We are supporting our schools so that they have effective in-school supports to address student behavior with a goal of reducing out-of-school suspension. We focus on restorative practices. In the past school year, we added 2 additional restorative practices specialists, and the year prior, we brought on 6 social emotional learning specialists. We are working on building our school's capacity around restorative practices, and our mayor made, in the last 2 years, significant investments in mental health, which allowed us to bring on board 74 additional community-based mental health practitioners last year, and we'll be bringing on about 20 additional this school year. In addition to that, our city council reallocated about $4 million from our SRO budget or security budget to support social emotional development at the school level. And we've launched a middle school pilot to address disproportionality and discipline. As we see, that is one of the areas for this year that we know that we really want to focus on additional supports and strategies, not only to keep young people in school, but to ensure that our discipline outcomes are equitable when we disaggregate our data by race. We also did early training with our principals on implicit bias to address disparity in the identification of boys of color for special education certifications, most specifically emotional disturbance categories. And then finally, really pushing around peer-led intervention. So our students, like, how can they be partners and have, how are they able to support the work we're doing? So training our students in mental health first aid, sources of strength, and peer mediation. So just finally here, I'll close by saying for us, educational inequities is both a moral and a fiscal imperative. And I reflect back on this statement from the Each and Every Child Report for Equity and Excellence in 2013. And I'll just read that as I close. It said that if Hispanic and African American students' performance grew to be comparable to their white performance and remain there for the next 80 years, the historical evidence indicates that the impact would be staggering, adding more than $50 trillion to our economy. And this amount constitutes more than 3 times the size of our current GPO, and it represents the income we forego by not ensuring equity for all of our students. It's a moral imperative because all of our children deserve our best, particularly our historically marginalized students, but it's also a loss to the nation financially when we do not reach these outcomes. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, and good morning. My name is Greg Baldwin, and I serve as the School Collaborative Culture Specialist for Alexandria City Public Schools. I do want to first take this opportunity to again thank Alfred Street Baptist Church and your amazing pastor, Dr. Howard John Wesley, and the Social Justice Ministry for extending to me this opportunity to participate in what I believe is such an important part of the work that we do as educators at Alexandria City Public Schools. First of all, I want to start by sharing that Alexandria City Public Schools serves more than 16,000 students who hail from more than 114 countries and speak 119 languages. Alexandria City Public Schools has 18 schools, including 2 middle schools, 2 K-8 schools, 1 pre-K school, and the internationally recognized T.C. Williams High School. Alexandria Public Schools is committed to ensuring that each and every student succeeds. And yet we recognize that racial inequities exist. And so our amazing and dynamic superintendent, Dr. Gregory Hutchins, has made equity the heart of what we do. As a school division, we realize and recognize that we play a vital role in eliminating racial inequities. So our strategic plan, Equity for All 2025, will be our roadmap for the next 5 years, and it places racial equity at its heart. It places racial equity at the center of everything that we do as a school division, and it challenges us to ensure that our students are engaged in classroom instruction and have access to the educational resources needed to enhance their learning experience. Next slide. So when we, again, talk about equity, it is to ensure for us, that students receive, every student receive what they need. So we talk about meeting students where they are and not necessarily where we want them to be. But we understand that when we address equity and then the inadequacies, what happens is that it ensures that all of our students will have the opportunity to be successful. It also ensures that students who unfortunately have been marginalized and criminalized and mistreated now will have an opportunity to access their full potential and gifts. And so we realize and recognize that deeply racialized systems are costly and they depress outcomes and life changes for all groups. So focusing on racial equity provides the opportunity to create goals and strategies that can also be applied to other areas of marginalization. And I do want to point out that 3 years ago, we actually began a process to ensure that all staff is trained in cultural competency and equity, and that this is still a work in progress. Next slide. We also talked about and recognize that suspensions is still a challenge. We still realize and recognize that there are disproportionalities that exist when we look at students of color and they are compared with white students. We also realize and recognize that there are still a disproportionality as we look at students with disabilities and compare them to their non-disabled peers. So we understand that these disproportionalities have to be addressed, and that we still have to continue to do the work necessary to ensure that that happens. Next slide. So I want to share with you something that's very dear to my heart that I've been working with now for some time, and we have implemented in Alexandria City Public Schools, and it's called restorative practices. And restorative practices is actually an alternative to punitive responses to wrongdoing. Restorative practices was actually inspired by indigenous traditions. It builds relationships, fosters communities, and brings together persons harmed with persons responsible for harm in a safe and respectful space. This promotes several things, including dialogue, accountability, and a stronger sense of community. When we look at the current data, it shows that African American, Latinx, and again, students with disabilities are disproportionately suspended and expelled when compared to other student groups. RP is a best practice that addresses these inequalities through structural changes that promote positive student voice, as well as develop more effective strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior of all students in a way that allows them to address their behavior and its impact on the community while not being excluded from classroom instruction. Next slide. So one of the other things I want to talk about, we talk about restorative practices, it really is a paradigm shift. When we think about traditional ways of dealing with discipline, unfortunately, many of these have come out of this zero policy tradition. Kind of like if you can't do the time, then don't do the crime. There's no grace, to borrow from our wonderful superintendent, Dr. Hutchins, and I also heard Dr. Braybrand use that word. So we talk about, you know, the punitive versus the restorative. The idea here is the punitive is that this is the rule that you broke, and now we're going to have to punish you. But when we talk about the restorative approach, it's an understanding that there's a harm that occurred, but it's not about the rule, it's about the relationship. The harm has occurred to a person or that particular community. And we find that when we look at it from that approach, students begin to understand that their actions impact others and not just themselves. And so we know that traditionally school administrators have responded to disciplinary issues with punitive actions such as loss of recess, detention, suspensions, and revoked privileges. And we note that there are a number of problems with punishment. They disproportionately affect students of color. They contribute to the preschool to prison pipeline, and they further isolate children who are often in need the most to be in pro-social environments which promote healthy, pure relationships. So we want to make sure that we continue to move towards a restorative school environment. And also it's a better option to teach children who act out to understand, again, the impact that their behavior has on others. And it can teach them how to feel empathy for the people affected by their actions, and they'll be more willing to repair the harm that they have caused. And another part of the work that we do is we work with restorative practices, is we use restorative practices as a vehicle by which we can actually share with students social, emotional, academic learning strategies, and share with students and teachers positive behavioral interventions and support as we work together collectively to ensure, again, that we address these issues of disproportionality and inequities. Next slide. So I also want to share this, though, that there's some myths and some who believe that restorative practices is a magic pill, that it's a cure-all, and it isn't. Doing the work, I'm going to admit that, but what I can tell you is that restorative practices will make a difference. When we talk about will it eliminate misbehavior throughout the school, if implemented properly, it will reduce discipline issues in the building, because what it will do is it will provide teachers with strategies in which they can look at other alternatives to sending students out of class. And one of the biggest things is this: it focuses on building relationships. I've been teaching now and an educator, served as an administrator, but during this almost 30-year period, the one thing I have learned is this, is that students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And it's all about building those relationships. Next slide. So I just want to share this slide with you because this particular slide talks about the continuum of restorative practices, because a lot of times I hear people say, oh, when we talk about restorative practice, we're doing circles. Well, restorative practices is bigger than circles. It's about a transformation of your mindset. So transitioning into a restorative school is an ongoing process, and for a number of years, schools, you find that you will gently incorporate restorative practices alongside traditional discipline. But the good news is that the restorative practices occur along a continuum. So restorative practices range from informal to formal, moving from left to right on the continuum. You notice that for effective statements, this is I statements. Again, the idea to use these I statements and I questions to help students develop a sense of empathy. And a final slide. And so here is just a list of just tips for restorative practice in the classroom. Just want to remind teachers that develop class agreements the first week of school. When doing circles, always plan, state the purpose of the circle. Remember that they are participants, allow the circle to guide their questions, and to continue to avail themselves to professional development around restorative practices. I do want to share with you that we use restorative practices to build relationships, foster communities, repair harm, to teach social, emotional, academic learning skills, as well as positive behavioral intervention support. But this summer, we actually lost a student and 2 members of staff. And so we added additional circles to our repertoire. We provided wellness circles to help staff cope during this dual pandemic of COVID-19 and institutional racism. And during that loss, we also had circles, celebration of life circles, to provide support to staff and students as well. So we do believe that restorative practice, along with all of the other practices that we're using, will help us as we continue to seek to have a schools system that is equitable, and we hope to dismantle the preschool to prison pipeline. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like everybody to show their camera. Thank you. So I want to get kind of straight to some of the things we've already talked about, particularly about hiring practices. And I want to call it what it is, and I'm going to use the word racist policy. And Dr. Brabrand, I think you'll relate to, Dr. Kennedy defines and says that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. So let's just get right to it, could we? Because I think a lot of what we've seen as far as the data, particularly for what Mr. Perriman expressed, was data showing the hiring practices in all of the districts represented here that tend to be disproportionate to not being a clear representation of the student body. So I'm just going to ask you some questions. This is for the whole panelist of district representatives, and it's particularly about the hiring practices and how there's a disproportionate. And I'm just going to say some actual facts before I get to the question, if that's okay. So for Fairfax Public Schools, the actual research that you spoke of, Mr. Perriman, dealing with Black teachers make up 13% of the applications, yet only 6% receive job offers, while white teachers make up 70% of applicants, but received 77% of all the job offers. So my question, and then I'll speak to Dr. Elliott and then Mr. Baldwin for your particular district. But the question is, what are you doing to make the policy anti-racist as far as hiring practices in your district? So first, Dr. Brabrand.
Well, thank you, Camille. A couple of things. First of all, we've committed to transparency. We've put out the hiring data for the last few years. We're going to put out this year's hiring data, and the data will be whatever the data is, we're going to confront it and work to continue to make it better. One of the things Sean mentioned that we have done We went from having a decentralized hiring pool where the pool was done at the school level, and now we have a centralized hiring pool. That centralized pool has more diversity. Now we need schools to use that central pool, and they have to. They have to interview from the central pool at least 3 applicants. We need to be sure that those applicants are diverse applicants as they do the interviews. And that's additional work with the region assistant superintendents and the principals to follow up to be sure that when we're having an open position, we have candidates of color. I do want to clarify one thing, and it was said at a couple places. We have about 20 to 25 schools that do not have an African-American teacher in it. We do have in all of our schools teachers of color. They may not all be African-American teachers, but they are. And that's just an important thing I want to put out there. That's still not enough. It's still not good. It's still not where we need to be. We've also worked in our Great Beginnings where we hire new teachers to create more cohorts of support for Black and Latino teachers, because many of them are coming into the building as one of the only of themselves. And what more can we do to give division supports to say, we need you in that school, we need to keep you. And I want to work with this community about what we can do too, to provide more wraparound and welcome so they feel they're supported. They're not just a single voice. And that's about hiring more and more kids. That's about hiring more and more teachers to support kids in our schools, whether that school is a very diverse school, because some of our most diverse schools have a lot of diversity in hiring. Frankly, it's our least diverse schools of kids that have the least diverse hiring. So we've got to get some teachers of color also to say, I need to go into a predominantly white school because there's work to do in that school if we're going to do the right kind of justice work, social justice work we want to do. Thanks for asking.
Sure. Mr. Perriman, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and forgive me if I misspoke by saying no teachers of color. I mean, as Dr. Brabrand acknowledged, having no African-American teachers in that many schools is terrible, but it's not something that just happened this year. This has been something that's been going on for several years. And what I would urge Dr. Brabrand to do is there should be a focus on these schools. This cannot continue that these 20 schools that we all know of don't have any African-American teachers, and we still haven't done anything to address those specific schools. I referenced the GMU study, which is a few years old now. It was finding that not only were there a suitable pool of African-American teachers, but they were often more qualified, had more education than their white counterparts and weren't being hired. And as Dr. Brabrand is saying, when they are hired, they're placed in the same school. So I don't think this is just on the teachers to apply to a bunch of schools. I think this is on the school system. If you know there are 20 schools that don't have any African-American teachers, I think this falls to them to remedy. This is not a thing that happened just this year. This has been an ongoing pattern.
Can we make a correction quickly? The number is 26 schools, right?
26, I believe, yes.
Yes, it is. Okay, so a question for you, Dr. Elliott. Out of the 39% of the teachers in DC public schools have 0 to 5 years of teaching experience. And the teacher experience data is more startling when it's broken down into wards. So wards with higher white student population, like Ward 2 and 3, for example, have more experienced teachers, so that there's clear data reflecting that the placement of experienced teachers in predominantly white student body populations, and those with the least amount of experience are placed in Southeast. Can you speak to what your district is doing to create an anti-racist hiring policy?
Sure. So just with regards to the data, I think, obviously data is always really complex. So I think one of the challenges that we often see is that for the schools that you're speaking to in those wards, there's very little turnover. So teachers are staying in those schools longer, and that equates to teachers having a longer amount of experience. So what when we dig down to the root cause, what we're trying to address is teacher turnover. So we do see in our schools in Ward 7 and 8 that they have a higher teacher turnover. And when we do things such as analyze our teacher survey data, we try to use that to get down to the root causes of conditions that may exist in schools that cause people to make decisions not to stay in those schools. So a couple of things that we're working to do is, again, to dig into the data to figure out what are our issues around retention. We are providing additional support and professional development because oftentimes in some of the schools in Ward 7 and 8, teachers may be serving a higher population of kids who are historically marginalized and may be coming in those teaching experiences without the skills and capacities to support students, particularly some of our most vulnerable children, students with high ACEs. So additional professional development and then increases in other wraparound supports. Not just for students, but for our teachers. So a focus on staff wellness resources to support teachers that are indicating high levels of stress, but additional mental health and other counseling resources in those schools to support students. So a lot of culture work has to happen in those schools as well. So we are ensuring that we're creating a safe, nurturing, supported, relationship-centered climate for our students, but also for our staff. So those are just a couple of items that we're working on.
Thank you. So the data, Mr. Baldwin, in Alexandria City Public Schools is not different necessarily than in DC or in Fairfax County. 63% of your teachers are white, 30% are Black, 8% are Hispanic. Yet the students are 36% Hispanic, 28% white, and 27% Black. Can you speak to the development of an anti-racist hiring policy in Alexandria City Public Schools?
Thank you so much, Camille, for affording me the opportunity to share. So I do want to start by saying, again, we have to acknowledge and recognize instances where we see disproportionality. And that is an area that we have to address. I can share with you some of the things that I know that we have done, and I have actually participated in myself, is that we actually go to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and intentionally look for educators of color that can come and be a part of our very diverse student population. And as part, again, of our strategic plan, again, our focus is on racial equity. And we realize and recognize that it's important for students to have teachers that look like them. But I also just want to say this, I just want to add, not only should we have people of color in the classroom, but also in central office leadership on the school board. For example, right now we have 3 women of color who are members of the Alexandria City Public School Board, and we have 2 young dynamic Black women as student representatives. We also have men and women of color holding executive leadership positions at ACPS Central Office, and we have a Black man who holds the position of superintendent. And so again, I do want to just stress that we are making strides in trying to address these disproportionalities and these historical situations where we have not had representation at the highest levels of school leadership of individuals that look like our students.
Thank you. I kind of want to respond a little bit to that, just because I don't think in any way the data is what the data is, right? And I don't think we're in any way saying that because there's a person of color or a Black person in the classroom or at the helm, we're going to see automatically the numbers just, everything's going to balance out. So I think it's about, kind of what Dr. Elliott, I think, spoke of being strategic, and kind of what you spoke of, Mr. Baldwin, or really being strategic about who you're hiring. So you're developing a level of kind of cultural awareness of the person, regardless of the color. But what we do see continually is that when there is a person who doesn't look like or have the experience of the student, this is where we see these disproportionalities. I want to speak to, because I think every single district, and when we looked at our research and looked at your websites, there has been a clear department of equity and positions of equity all the way up to the superintendent in Fairfax County, yet these disparities still exist. So I'd like to know, what does the equity office or department in your school district actually do? What are they tasked with doing? So anybody can answer that question.
I'll be glad to start. I think something that I think we're continuing to do is create a conversation. We're not going to erase, Fairfax County is 150 years old, right? We're not going to erase 150 years in the 3 years I've been here. We put a chief equity officer in. We put an equity lead in every school. We've been clear about expectations for that equity lead, and we have equity specialists in each region that are supporting the equity leads in the school and the principal. I acknowledge that we can have tighter expectations, and we're sharing about what the equity lead is to do in those schools with the principal. The principal is still the key equity leader of the school, and they have to take a stand. You know, Sean talked about the power of a principal. Any principal, African-American, Latino, white, who comes in with a vision of equity for all kids, that's how you actually get teachers to come and get teachers to stay. We're finding our teacher turnover data is driven by the more than anything, the quality and the perception of the leadership of the principal. I think the equity folks are there to be in every school improvement conversation when the school's looking at data to say, what does this mean with an equity lens? And they're there to be social justice champions, and we're following up with them. We're providing cultural responsive professional development, and we're digging into data. We have a data specialist in every region, and the equity specialist is working with the data specialist to uncover those uncomfortable truths and say, what are we going to do? We feel the urgency, and we believe the equity work is happening. I think the frustration for many, I get it. People waited their whole life. They want it now. How quickly can we move institutions toward anti-racist, anti-bias orientations? We're in the middle of doing that work in Fairfax. There's much more to be done, but we're in the middle of doing it. And those equity leads in our schools and departments are helping make sure that the voice of equity is raised in every conversation. And it is changing culture. And we're going to see more data, I believe, move in the right direction that suggests not just talking about equity, but seeing it translate into action and into results, which is what we all want.
I'll just jump in and add just a tad bit to that. And once we did have a chief equity officer in DC, and now I have an equity team and a number of other levers that we feel are our most important equity levers. So like in addition to our equity department, I also have talent development, which is recruitment and selection. So we tie equity strategies to that work. Also have student behavior team. So we tie our equity work very specifically to that team as well. And we have teacher evaluation. So we have a way that we look using an equity lens into the data. But what we try to think about in terms of our equity framework is that there are 4 areas that we have to influence. We have to think about how we influence the mindsets of our people. So they're, around their will to do this work. So really digging deep to what people believe about children, particularly in children of color, and how we shift their mindsets around that through training. In our district, we do dig into critical race theory and really helping folks understand the permanence of whiteness and white supremacy, how dominant narratives impact what we believe, implicit bias. So we feel like we have to do that shifts individually, also through our teams. And then the other two areas we focus on is like, how do we ensure that there is equity in our policies? So as an institution, our policies drive a lot what we do, and we have to be sure that those policies are anti-racist. And so what we have started to do more intentionally is to look at the outcome of policy. So we might have a policy that on the surface seems to be neutral, but if the outcomes of the implementation of that policy result in disparate outcomes for one particular group, for us it's most often children of color, then we've got to see how we revise that policy so that it does not result in a racist outcome. And then the final place is not just policy, is practice. So what do people really do? And so we really try to look at data around our practices and how that influences what happens for our students. In our equity policy, what we've done is defined equity. We have this equity lens that I just described to you. We have named where we have institutional bias in our system and persistent disparities. And the final thing is our list of shared commitments. So what are the data points as a district we are committed to move? So like, you know, I've shared, and I think all of us have shared very transparently our data where we see inequities, particularly for us, one of the places we really focus on is the inequities in our academic outcomes. And we are being intentional about this cannot stay here. So we have to think about what are the strategies that are in play that we put in place to move those metrics. We continue to look at those metrics and we make decisions around, do we have the right people in the right positions to move those metrics? Do we have the right strategies in place? So I think those are ways that we really work to put our money where our mouth is with our equity work and make sure that for DC, final thing I'll say is that everybody in this agency has to be an equity leader to disrupt 400 years of race and racism in this nation. We can't just have one equity officer or 5 people on an equity team. Everybody has to own this work and be held accountable for it.
Thank you. Mr. Baldwin, could you respond from the Alexandria City Schools perspective?
Yes, like Dr. Elliott says, everyone has to own this work. So again, equity is such an important part of what I do. I'm actually a part of the equity team. And I just want to talk about some of the things that we've been doing because we've been focusing on leadership facilitation and racial equity turnaround training to support all staff, equity liaisons. We have equity audits that we have already administered and received just invaluable information from culturally responsive teaching. And, you know, as I shared earlier, we've been providing training in equity since 2017 with the overall goal, again, to address the disproportionalities that we have in our schools. And we also understand that this equity work and support that we provide will continue to ensure that those disproportionalities decrease instead of increase. And we have these courageous conversations because first of all, it starts with acknowledgement. You have to acknowledge that there's a problem. And these conversations, I'll be honest with you, they're not easy. They're difficult. And we've been having these conversations. And so I think our other responsibility is to ensure that we do that. And the other thing, you know, our director, she says it a lot, that we're on an anti-racist journey and looking at all of our work in the division through an equity lens. We're looking at our practices and policies through an equity lens to see what we need to change in order to make sure that they are equitable. And I want to say this, and then I'll finish. Many of you may know, it's been in the news that we're in the process of changing the name of our high school, T.C. Williams High School, named after a racist segregationist superintendent, Thomas Chambers Williams. And so we've been focusing on and talking about what is the name change going to be. And I gave that some thought, and we had some conversation about that because there's this big focus, because I'm for it. I'm a T.C. Williams graduate, but let's change the name. And we have a big focus right now on on symbolic racism, and we dealing with tearing down monuments and statues. But what I think we make sure we don't need and we don't lose focus of is we still need to tear down structural racism, institutional racism. And as we continue to do this equity work, that's what we want to make sure, that if there are policies and practices in place, institutions in place, that we tear them down. We are on an anti-racist journey.
Thank you. I'm looking at and kind of trying to piggyback on some of the things you all were talking about as far as anti-racist policy and things that you're rethinking, particularly curriculum. So I'm wondering about, we're talking about this, the history of this nation, and Dr. Elliott, I acknowledge and recognize that you did speak about having conversations about whiteness, having conversations about privilege. You know, Dr. Brigman, you talked about student voice. You know, there's a clear connection here when you have these very diverse school districts, but students don't hear their stories being told, yet their stories are American stories, right? And then the disconnect between teachers that are then punishing those students because of the disconnect that is between the teacher and the student's culture. Could you speak then about how, or if you have, revamped or changed your curriculum during this of racial recognition?
Two quick things on that. We've done massive curriculum work, and we'll have a full update on that on Tuesday at our school board work session. I really encourage many people watching today to come and see all the work we've done and are going to continue to do. We're just getting started, but we have done a lot. We've thrown out thousands and thousands of inappropriate materials and lessons that teachers had access to that were not historically representing history from an equitable viewpoint. Total revamp. The other thing I want to tell you that I forgot to just mention, we're not just talking student voice this year. We're going down to the student level. We're going to have student equity ambassadors, 2 in every high school. Then we're going to middle and elementary, but 2 in every high school, to be elevated to have voice at the school level, at the leadership level, so that voices from marginalized kids are being heard. And we'll be sharing more about that next month with our school board. But we know the kids know the truth. The kids have no filter and being willing to bring truth to power. And kids are the ones who are going to set us free and accelerate some of this work. I know too, we have a school board student rep who is an African-American young man, and he calls it out with respect, but he calls it out. And the more we keep doing that, the students are going to help us. They're the untapped resource this year. These equity ambassadors, I think, are going to speed up work in a way that we haven't. And maybe in a future forum, we can bring some of them to you and have some conversations, both in our school district, but across the region, because the kids know the deal and they're willing to tell us what we need to hear.
Thank you.
I have a question that I also wanted to raise, and actually it goes back to some data that was pointed out earlier. And this is actually a question for all panelists, but I'm going to use the example that Dr. Brabrand had mentioned previously. Dr. Brabrand, in one of your slides, it mentions that only 4.9% of approximately 190,000 students are in the discipline pipeline. If I were to map those students, I think that my hunch would say that perhaps these students are distributed disproportionately according to certain geographies and certain schools. So when you mention that there are equity officers or leaders in different schools, is there anything being done extra in places and geographies in schools where there are clusters? And then in order to combat the disproportionality, are there additional resources available there? And so if you could maybe comment on that, and also the other district representatives, students is in areas where there is a higher concentration of students entering the discipline pipeline. I think that would be really informative. Thank you.
Yeah, Karen, I think I got it. I may have missed a little bit. I don't know if others, it got a little choppy, but we do have Office of School Support teams for each school, and data, including discipline data, and there's an equity specialist on those teams, an equity specialist who can go, oh my God, you got an issue with math achievement. We're going to bring in a math person. You got an issue with discipline. That equity person can come in and provide additional restorative justice training, sit down with the administrators and go, what's in your data? We are doing that. We are doing it with much more of a focus than ever before. And, you know, something, again, that everybody, Sean has mentioned, is the urgency of, we can't keep seeing the same data again and again. You've got to do it differently. And I think, frankly, all of us, all districts across the country, but all of us here, we've been come up over the last couple of years, but I think we're in a moment where people are changing their hearts and minds as a result of what they're seeing happen in our country, in our world. And it's being elevated as this is the thing. It is, as I told our leadership conference, all of our leaders this year, this is not something to add to your plate. Equity is the plate. It's the whole meal. This is what is the main struggle in education for years has been achievement gaps. And in some ways that's a myth. The gap is doing equity right, and we won't have the achievement gaps. So we do have direct resources for schools that need them, and we're going to continue to keep that as a focus.
Would anyone else like to comment now? Okay. Then actually, I'm going to move on to our final moderated question. Oh, I'm sorry, Valerie.
I was just going to share that, Dr. Brabrand, I appreciate what you're sharing, and you're absolutely right. Equity is the entire plate. And if we look even at the history of our nation, right? So, you know, we had the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, and we didn't see the Civil Rights Act until 1964. And then, you know, so we are only 55, 56 years into this whole idea that everyone should be treated equitably. I'm not going to say equally, because equality means we started at the same place. And I'm not even sure that equity was intended with the Civil Rights Act. But as we are now looking at education and looking at how we are indeed going to provide equitable education for every child, and we recognize that we have had hundreds of years of conditioning that white children should be treated better and Black children should be relegated to the side, and other children, non-white children, should be placed off to the side, and their education, it's okay if it's substandard. And even when we look at the turnover that's happening in the schools with the children with the most significant needs, it's not that those teachers are no longer teaching. They just tend to move to the schools where the white children are. It's almost as if they cut their teeth in the areas where children with the greatest needs are, and then they go and find themselves a comfortable spot in an area where they are going to teach children, white children, basically. And so while we are moving this needle in a direction of true equity, we've got to be sure that we are looking at all of those factors and doing something about them. We can't know that that's what's happening and say, well, you know, I appreciate that there are equity officers in every school. I appreciate all of those factors, but until we're able to dismantle those very systems that allow for such things, we've got folks who keep commenting about, you know, I didn't get the opportunity. And I know that my skin color played a factor in it. I know that the fact that I was a woman played a factor in it. And I'm grateful that even the removing of much of the curriculum that has a biased and a tainted portrayal of history, so glad that those things are being removed. But this issue of ensuring that every child, you know, those children with different learning abilities, or children with disabilities, children of color, English language learning students, Latinx students, Black students, when they not only see themselves represented in the faculty, not only, you know, are they ensure that they are going to be able to access the learning environment, but that they are learning about their piece of American history, when it is truly an equitable environment from every angle. That's when we are really going to change the dynamic of what's going on here. We can't do a piece of this and a piece of that. It has truly got to be a holistic approach to dismantling all of these systems that we've only truly begun to even acknowledge exist for the last 55 years. It's only been 55 years. And, you know, we've got hundreds of years of the constructing of it. And so I applaud those of you that are doing this hard work. And, you know, I am so grateful that I'm able to add my voice, add the work of Rise for Youth to that fight. But, you know, we have to acknowledge all of those things, right? That we have only been at this table of providing equity for 55 years.
So we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We do appreciate that you're with us still. We do want to move on to Q&A, but there is one question, one last final moderated question, and maybe we can pick up the pace and with the final question. So I'll get to it. Our last moderated question is the teacher referral process. If the district representatives could describe what the teacher referral process is for discipline, because to me, it seems like that's where rubber hits the road for racism, for bias, for discrimination, because it is based on interpretation. And so I think what we've discussed is that there is a lot of teacher training that maybe ticks a lot of compliance boxes. So it's like tick, tick, received education. How is the teacher referral process tracked over time to ensure that disciplinary issues, are behavioral issues, or racist, biased, discriminatory issues are not feeding into the pipeline?
I'll go real quick, Karen. I do just want to go back and say we're creating a universal referral form instead of just each school coming up with their own. And then we have a discipline checklist for administrators right up front in that referral. Has unconscious bias be considered? What's the teacher's management style? Are they being referred by the same staff member frequently? What interventions have been done prior to the referral? So we're going to start pushing people to answer hard questions as these referrals come in. We cannot have classrooms as referral factories. I can tell you what my own experience as a principal was. A very small number of teachers were the majority of the referrals. Most teachers are not engaged in doing it, but some are, and then those folks need to be given interventions and, if necessary, removed from schools. That's the bottom line. And we are doing it systematically with the referral form pilot this year and all schools next year. And the checklist for administrators is going out this year. When you get that form, is there bias? What's that teacher's past behavior? And really engage that teacher to go, why is this referral coming into the office? I think it's going to help, and I'll be glad to share updates next year or during the year as we're engaged in this work. Thanks.
Thank you.
I would quickly chime in. We have a data system that we've used for a number of years that we're able to capture all suspension data from our schools, but we are not capturing it at the teacher level consistently across schools. So I know that is some work that we are focused on. We right now capture what we consider to be our tier 2 and tier 3 behaviors. So those are the ones that result and an in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. So that's more work that, you know, that we have to do as a district to actually see what is underneath that. Having been a high school and middle school principal, my experience is similar to what Dr. Braban has articulated, that you have most of your referrals are coming from just a handful of teachers, and it's typically classroom management issues or teachers lacking skills around cultural responsiveness to their classrooms, or implicit bias or racism. Like, those are typically the things underneath. They either don't have the skill or they don't have the will to ensure that all kids are educated. But that is certainly work that we'll have to continue in DC public schools, that I believe is like underneath the disproportionality. At least in other school districts that I work, that's what I saw. And I'll just quickly end on this one piece. I have done this work around equity, particularly around discipline, for probably the last 7 years. And in one school district, what we found was that principals pretty much suspend equitably. So say a principal is getting 10 referrals for suspension, 10 for white kids, 10 for black kids. What they're typically, if 2 referrals are going to be suspended for white kids, 2 are for black. So it's kind of equitable. But where the inequity is in the referrals that come from the teacher level. So what we found in this school district was that 80% of the referrals that were coming in were for students of color and 20% were for white children. And so when the principal is looking at that, even though they might be suspending equitably based on the number of referrals, because there's so much disproportionality in that teacher work, that's how we're ending up with those inequities around suspension. So the work that we have done around, and it sounds like also in Fairfax and in Alexander, to eliminate the reasons by which kids can get suspended. So if you're cutting out those subjective behaviors like disrespect or disruptive, if you're saying, hey, we're not going to suspend a kid for this, we're going to dig in and figure out what's the reason. Is it a teacher management problem? What's the restorative ways that we can support young people in their classroom? I think that's how we really get to that work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please continue.
I was just going to share on behalf of Alexandria, again, just want to applaud Dr. Elliott and Dr. Braban for the work that they're doing in that issue dealing with the disproportionality concerning referrals. Yes, it is a concern, and I share their sentiments. We revamped our multi-tiered systems of support. Data is tracked quarterly and yearly, and teacher referrals are addressed by administration through our multi-tiered systems of support. And then interventions are put in place, and then we provide training to teachers and positive behavioral interventions and support, as well as restorative practices and social, emotional, academic learning. And we also provide support and training for teachers on culturally responsive teaching, as well as implicit bias. And we know also that microaggressions also come into play when we talk about students being referred. And again, that goes right back to equity, making sure that we look at even the referrals that come through an equitable lens, because the teachers, they will write the referral and send it to the administrator. It's up to the administrator at that point to decide what the consequence is going to be. And so I just want to share this also. One of the things we've done is we've also revamped our student code of conduct. Our student code of conduct actually will share with you what the infraction is and then what the consequence is going to be. And we share with everyone, suspension should be the last thing, not the first thing that you go to. And so in our student code of conduct, you will see responsive options. So responsive and restorative options. So you can look at, if there's a situation where it's a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, this is the restorative practice that you can use instead of some other type of consequence that would, unfortunately, in many cases, cause students to lose their opportunity to be included in the classroom and be excluded.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to move to our Q&As from our audiences. So one of the questions asked, and I think maybe Sean, if we could, you might want to respond to this, is that what does safety look like without school resource officers? Dr. Brabrand also mentioned that SROs are an integral part of, or an important part to a school campus. So what does that look like, right, when SROs are not on campus?
Sure, and I think it's important to ask, safe for who? Because I think a lot of what we're seeing is that SROs actually are not safe for students of color, because it is putting them into the system that's ultimately going to harm them. So what I would say is, for us, when we say get the SROs out of school, we mean literally outside of the schools. I do not see a reason why the SROs need to be interacting with students as if they are a principal, a counselor, or a teacher. They're neither. They're none of those things. So for us, it could be that there's an SRO stationed somewhere on the campus that doesn't, have them patrolling the halls, or it could be that they're, simply down the block, depending on the location of the school. So I think that when we say get the SROs out of school, we mean stop tasking cops who are trained at essentially, putting down threats to deal with the children, especially disabled children or students with disabilities, Black children, and Latinx children. We see the outcomes time and time again, and I do not think it makes our schools any safer from violent acts from outside the schools. And it's also something that those acts can be addressed without having the SROs dealing with children on a day-to-day basis.
Dr. Brabrand, then also, what then should the role of the SRO be on campus?
So Karen, one of the things, this is something the school board is going to be talking about as a forum topic very soon. So I welcome multiple voices to the conversation, and I know the school board wants to have it. SROs have been part of creating a culture of safety for our students. It's one of the things we ask in our school survey: do you feel safe at school? I do think, and this is a larger question and a larger conversation, in our communities today, we can remove SROs tomorrow from schools, but are we going to still see some of the same disconnects between law enforcement and our communities, especially our communities of color? And I still believe that school is where the community comes together to educate our young people, to make connections. And I think the SROs have a role in building social justice. But I know not everybody sees it that way. I'm open to the discussion, and something Valerie said, we have a lot of history in schools. We have a lot of history with law enforcement, but I believe we need to have a discussion about how we can start to use folks as a tool for conversations that haven't had. Even if they're removed from school, some of these same issues are going to be in the community. How do we really keep our schools and community tied to tackle this work and have conversations? And I think schools are still a great convener that bring people together to have those conversations. And I know our school board is going to have those this year. And I look forward to sharing my voice and hearing other voices. Thank you.
And Camille, I believe, has the final audience question.
One of the questions deals with kind of lessons learned during this distance learning time, and how has some of your policy changed, particularly dealing with absenteeism and truancy, which tends to be a real link as far as discipline. Students who didn't even commit an offense or have a discipline issue, but just were out of school for a certain amount of days. How are you, if at all, changing policy for students that are going to be absent for whatever reason because during distance learning time?
So I think I understand the question, but I'm not sure. So hopefully I won't divert too far off the path. So we do.
I know that all of your school districts are mandating attendance, right? During virtual learning. So what are you going to do, you know, in the event that students have absences? Are you using the same?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, got you. So I mean, we don't suspend kids for not coming to school. I know that was raised earlier, like I do understand like the history of that and where that's come from, but we don't suspend kids for not coming to school. We want them in school. And we know that there are many reasons right now, like this COVID situation is so complex for children and for families and for all of us working adults. So we know that particularly for our most vulnerable children, they often are watching siblings because their parents are essential workers and are having to go to work. And so they're trying to help their little brothers and sisters do online learning. And for some of our high school and middle school students, they're really struggling to get to their own learning because of these additional responsibilities that we have. So we are pretty flexible with this, with regards to the virtual learning. We have it so that young people can participate synchronously, which means like they're on the time that their teacher is on, but they also, we have some recorded lessons so students can participate outside of that time. So one of the things around our attendance for your attendance that day, you need to have logged on somewhere between I believe 6 o'clock in the morning and midnight. So you have a lot of flexibility in when you get into your class, so that our children can work around the many obligations and their families can work around the many obligations that they have. But we want our kids to be connected. We're all super worried about the learning loss. And we know that this COVID, whether it's around health or around learning, we just exacerbate outcomes for our Black and Brown children during this time. So trying to prioritize our schools in Ward 7 and Ward 8 for getting technology and access to internet, and our young people that are living in shelters or other temporary housing to make sure that they have those resources, as well as now we're trying to figure out how we actually stand up some face-to-face support. So our thing is we don't want to find out 2 months from now that a kid did not connect and there was something seriously wrong in that household with that child. Like we're worried about kids that we haven't heard from after lots of outreach. And we still follow our criteria that if we haven't been able to connect with kids in a certain period of time, that we make referrals to the Children Protective Services. If we've made home visits and other things and we can't connect because we're worried about like, where are those children? Are they still in the district? Are they safe? But we really try to work to ensure that that's not punitive for children or their families, because the last thing our families need is more state engagement or city engagement when they're really struggling to hold together all the things they're trying to hold. So hopefully that was close to what you're looking for.
Thank you.
One quick thing I'll say, just in addition to everything Dr. Elliott said, is we're recording our lessons. We're asking teachers to record them. So if you miss, you're able to go back and watch that content. And that really is a big advantage. Some kids, it's too much screen time. They need a break. Some kids just need the flexibility. Their parents are working or they have a job. So the recording is something we've asked all teachers to do, and then they post and have that up to let students go back and look at that if they missed it. So more flexible attendance is part of what the state of Virginia has asked all school districts to do.
And our situation is very similar to what Dr. Brabant and Dr. Elliott shared. And yes, we don't suspend for students not attending. But what does happen is this, you know, if we notice that students have not signed in, then that's a red flag. That there may be something wrong. And so that gives us another opportunity to provide support. And so we've been working with our school support teams, our school counselors and social workers who are responsible for following up with these students and families who have not actually checked in. And again, during this dual pandemic of COVID-19 and institutional racism, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of challenges that families are facing, and even teachers who are actually struggling during this time. And so, most definitely, we always want to make sure that academics is our focus, but we also making sure that we put major emphasis on social, emotional, and mental wellness issues as it concerns our students and our staff. So, yes, we want our students to be engaged. We want our students to be present. But we also know that if they're not, then we need to identify what are some of the barriers. Are they dealing with homelessness? Are they dealing with a situation with technology? Or they don't have access to internet? So, when we don't see students engaged, those are the type of questions that we begin to ask and try to make sure that we're able to provide the support that they need to become reengaged.
Thank you. We want to thank you all so much for your candidness and your willingness to respond to both our moderated questions as well as the Q&A, and just your participation in this panel discussion, and those audience members who stuck along beyond our time. We want to also let the audience members know that if they want any more information on this topic and or anything dealing with the social justice ministry of Alfred Street Baptist Church, you can email us at socialjustice@alfredstreet.org.
Yes, thank you very much. I echo those thoughts. And also we will try to make sure that we do address all questions in our follow-up that you can receive with the email that you use to register. So finally, in our call to action, we wanted to provide some basic steps, how to follow up on this. And first, obviously, we would suggest you join the social justice ministry at Alfred Street. And then in your school district, know your school district policies about discipline. Learn the resources, which are often called supports or interventions in your district that keep students in school. The goal is 0 missed days of instruction. Also to interact with school leaders. And then in your community, to track state dollars and how state dollars are used. For example, whether they are used for SROs, and then also to engage in relationship. So now I switch to Minister Donna.
Thank you. Before we start this time in prayer, I just want to begin with a quote from Thomas Merton, who is a theologian. And I just also, again, want to extend on behalf of Karen and Camille, who did a wonderful job, but also on the behalf of Pastor Wesley, to say thank you. Thank you so much for your time and doing and having these courageous conversations around preschool in the prison pipeline. Thank you. And thank you to all those who participated and those who were here listening. We thank you. But I want to start with a quote by Thomas Merton, a theologian. He or she who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening their self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give others. So for us to see that change, it begins with us as well, that we really do have to search our hearts and our minds in who we are. And when I say with us, I mean whether it be our educators, whether it be our school leaders, whether it be our community leaders, national leaders, we need to search our hearts to make sure that we are doing and giving the very best that we can. So please join me. Bow your heads in prayer. Almighty God, guide our nation and local communities into the way of justice and truth. Continue, Father, to raise up parents, teachers, school leaders, and a justice system that embrace Ephesians 6:4, which says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Our past is one of being overly punitive, Father, but we are trusting you for a brighter future for our children. We know that Jehovah is a God of wonder and true restoration. And in the kingdom of his grace, miracles are commonplace. Father, keep us, help us to rewrite the narrative for our children. Let it become a story about preschool to promise, Father, and purpose. In the precious name of Jesus Christ, we lift up all these prayers and this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you have a really wonderful weekend.